The sound of tearing fabric cut through the diner like a gunshot. In that frozen moment, as Lila's torn shirt exposed her scarred shoulder to the fluorescent lights, every patron held their breath, except for the leather-clad bikers in the corner booth. The tattooed stranger's smirk lasted exactly 3 seconds before James Cooper of the Hells Angels stood up his chair, scraping against linoleum like a battle cry. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he said quietly, and the storm outside suddenly seemed like the least dangerous thing in Denver that night. What happened next would birth a legend that still echoes through Colorado's biker community, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Stick with me till the end, and drop a comment about which city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story has traveled. The Red Line Diner squatted on the edge of Denver's industrial strip like a glowing ember against the darkness, its neon sign flickering intermittently as rain lashed the windows with increasing fury. Inside, the warmth of coffee and grease created a bubble of normalcy that felt increasingly fragile as the storm intensified. Jack Red Kincaid wiped down the counter with practiced efficiency, his movements betraying the economy of motion that 23 years on the Denver police force had drilled into his muscle memory. At 62, Red still carried himself like a cop, shoulders squared, eyes that swept the room every few minutes, cataloging faces and exits with unconscious precision. The badge might have been retired 18 months ago, but the instincts remained sharp as broken glass. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of service, moved the cloth in deliberate circles, while his mind tracked the storm's progression through the subtle changes in wind pressure against the diner's walls. "Coffee's getting cold," Red called out James Cooper from the corner booth, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone of too many cigarettes and long rides. The Hells Angels. Denver chapter president sat with 3 of his brothers, Mike, Ray, and Nathan, their leather cuts draped over the booth backs like armor temporarily set aside. They'd been regulars for the past year, ever since Red had made it clear that in his diner everyone was welcome as long as they kept the peace. "Then drink it faster," Red shot back, allowing a rare smile to crack his stoic expression. The bikers laughed, a rumbling sound that mixed with the thunder outside. These weren't the Hollywood version of outlaw bikers. These were veterans, small business owners, men with families who rode because the Brotherhood meant something deeper than most people could understand. Lila Park moved between tables with fluid grace, refilling cups and taking orders with an efficiency that belied the tremor in her hands whenever thunder crashed particularly close. At 28, she carried herself with a careful awareness of space, always positioning herself with clear paths to exits, never letting anyone get too close without warning. The other waitstaff had learned not to touch her shoulder unexpectedly the one time someone had. Lila's reaction had been so visceral that Red had to spend an hour talking her down in the break room. The bell above the door chimed barely audible over the storm's crescendo. A man entered, water streaming from his leather jacket, his presence immediately shifting the diner's atmosphere like a pressure drop before a tornado. He was tall, perhaps 6'3", with intricate tattoos crawling up his neck and disappearing into a sharp jawline. His eyes, cold and calculating, swept the room with predatory interest before settling on Lila. "Coffee," he said, taking a seat at the counter without removing his jacket. His voice carried an accent, Eastern European, maybe Russian, that seemed to add weight to the single word. Lila approached with the pot, maintaining professional distance. As she poured, the man's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with enough force to make her gasp. The coffee pot trembled, hot liquid splashing dangerously close to the counter's edge. "Pretty thing like you shouldn't be working in a dump like this," he said, his grip tightening as his other hand reached for her collar. The sound that followed fabric tearing seemed to echo in the sudden silence that fell over the diner. Lila's uniform shirt ripped from collar to mid-chest, exposing not just skin, but a network of scars that told a story of survival. Old burns, precise cuts, the kind of marks that spoke of deliberate cruelty rather than accident. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The stranger's eyes glittered with satisfaction, his lips curving into a smile that never reached his eyes. "Damaged goods," he murmured loud enough for half the diner to hear. "Someone already had their fun with—" The sentence never finished. James Cooper was already moving his massive frame covering the 15 feet from booth to counter with surprising speed. But it was Red who got there first, his hand clamping down on the stranger's wrist with a grip that spoke of decades breaking up bar fights and subduing suspects. "Let go," Red said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made smart people comply immediately. "Now." The stranger, who would later identify himself as Victor, released Lila's wrist, but didn't break eye contact with Red. "Old man playing hero, this your woman?" "She's my employee," Red replied, positioning himself between Victor and Lila, who had stumbled backward, clutching her torn shirt with shaking hands. "And you're about to leave." The other angels had risen from their booth not aggressively, but with the coordinated movement of men who'd faced violence together before. They formed a loose semicircle, not threatening, just present, a geometry of protection that spoke louder than words. Victor stood slowly, water still dripping from his jacket. "I don't take orders from washed-up cops." The fact that he knew Red's history sent a chill through the room that had nothing to do with the storm. "Then take them from us," James said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent that made the other patrons start edging toward exits. "You've got 5 seconds to apologize to the lady and leave." Victor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Or what the mighty Hell's Angels gonna defend a scarred-up waitress? What would your brothers think playing knight for damaged?" Nathan, the youngest of the angels at 35, had already shrugged off his leather cut and was holding it out to Lila. "Here," he said gently, his back to Victor, deliberately vulnerable. "It's warm." The gesture, simple, human, protective, without aggression, seemed to infuriate Victor more than any threat could have. His hand moved toward his jacket's inner pocket, a motion that made Red's hand drift toward his hip, where muscle memory expected a service weapon that was locked in his office safe. "I wouldn't," Mike said quietly. The Vietnam veteran hadn't moved from his position by the booth, but something in his stillness made Victor's hand pause. "Whatever you're thinking, it's not worth it." The door chimed again. Sarah Kincaid entered, shaking rain from her detective's shield as she clipped it back to her belt. Red's daughter carried herself with the same unconscious authority as her father, her hand resting casually on her service weapon as she assessed the scene with cop's eyes. "Problem here, Dad?" she asked, though her gaze never left Victor. "Gentleman was just leaving," Red replied. Victor's smile widened. "Detective Kincaid, I heard you worked this district. How's that case going, the one with the missing girls?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. "You seem well informed for someone I've never seen before." "I make it my business to know things," Victor replied, finally, stepping back from the counter. He pulled out a $100 bill, letting it flutter to the floor rather than placing it on the counter. "For the shirt. I'll be back for my coffee." As he moved toward the door, he paused beside the Angel's booth. "You boys should be careful. Lots of dangerous roads on a night like this. Be a shame if someone had an accident." Ray, who hadn't spoken yet, simply smiled. "We'll take our chances." Victor left the door slamming shut behind him with enough force to rattle the glass. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lila's knees buckled, and both Red and Nathan moved to catch her. "I'm okay," she whispered, though her whole body shook. "I'm okay, You're not okay, and that's fine," Sarah said, moving to block the view from the remaining patrons. "Dad, you got a first aid kit, and maybe something from Lost and Found she can change into." As Red guided Lila toward the back office, James picked up his phone. "Need to make some calls," he said to his brothers. "That wasn't random." "No?" Mike agreed, his eyes still on the door. "That was reconnaissance." The storm outside intensified, lightning illuminating the parking lot where Victor sat in a black SUV, speaking rapidly into a phone. Through the rain-streaked windows, the Angels could see other vehicles pulling into the lot, 3, then 4, then 5. "Red," James called out, his voice carrying a new urgency. "We're about to have company." Red emerged from the back office, Lila now wearing an oversized Red Line diner sweatshirt, her hands steadier, but her eyes still wide with residual fear. He moved to the window, counting vehicles, calculating odds with the automatic precision of tactical training. "Sarah, call for backup," he said quietly. His daughter was already on her radio, but the response made her curse under her breath. "Flash flooding on I-25. Multiple accidents. Every available unit is tied up. ETA for any backup is 45 minutes minimum." "Power's flickering," one of the remaining customers noted nervously as the lights dimmed and brightened in rhythm with the lightning strikes. Red moved to the door, flipping the lock. "Everyone who's not involved in this needs to leave through the kitchen exit. Now." Most of the patrons didn't need to be told twice, gathering their things and filing quickly toward the back. But a handful remained, an elderly couple in the corner, a young mother with 2 children and a trucker who'd been quietly nursing coffee at the counter. "That means you too," Red told them. The elderly man stood slowly, his wife clutching his arm. "We've been coming here for 12 years, Jack. We're not running now." The trucker nodded. "I've got a tire iron in my cab. If you need an extra hand—" "This isn't your fight," James interrupted. "Maybe not," the trucker replied, "but I saw what that asshole did. Some fights choose you." A sharp knock on the door made everyone freeze. Victor's face appeared in the glass, his smile wider now, predatory. "Open up," he called out, voice muffled by the storm. "We just want to talk." "Talking's done," Red called back. Victor's smile never wavered. "Then we'll have to continue the conversation differently." He stepped back, and something arced through the air toward the window. "Down!" Mike shouted, recognizing the shape a split second before the tear gas canister shattered the glass and began spewing thick, acrid smoke into the diner. Chaos erupted. The elderly woman screamed. The children started crying. Sarah grabbed a menu and used it to bat the canister back toward the broken window, but the damage was done. Smoke filled the front of the diner, making eyes water and throats burn. "Kitchen!" Red commanded, his cop voice cutting through the panic. "Everyone to the kitchen now!" As they retreated, more windows shattered. Dark figures moved in the parking lot surrounding the building with military precision. This wasn't a random attack, this was a siege. In the kitchen, Red pulled an old .45 from a hidden holster behind the industrial refrigerator, checking the magazine with practiced efficiency. "Sarah, get on the landline. Try to get through to dispatch again." "Phone's dead," she reported after a moment. "They cut the line." James and his brothers had formed a defensive position by the kitchen's swing doors, using overturned prep tables as makeshift cover. "How many rounds you got, Red?" 18 plus what Sarah's carrying. We don't carry inside the city," James replied, then smiled grimly. "But we've got other tools." Nathan produced a length of chain from his jacket. Mike pulled out a combat knife that looked like it had seen action in several wars. Ray simply cracked his knuckles. "That's not going to be enough," Lila said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood straighter now, the fear in her eyes replaced by something harder. "There's something you should know about those scars." Before she could continue, the lights went out completely. The power hadn't just flickered, it was gone. Emergency lighting kicked in, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that made the shadows seem alive. "Generator's in the basement," Red said. "It should." The generator rumbled to life, restoring partial power, but the regular lights stayed off. Someone had been selective about what they'd disabled. A voice echoed through the broken windows. Not Victor's, but someone older, more authoritative. "Mr. Kincaid, we have a simple proposition. Give us Victor, and everyone walks away. You have 2 minutes to decide." "Victor?" Sarah looked confused. "But he's with them." A crash from the storage room cut her off. They turned to see Victor himself, the same man who'd torn Lila's shirt, stumbling through the rear entrance, blood running from a gash on his forehead. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing to his knees. "They're trying to kill me." Red kept his gun trained on the man. "What the hell is going on?" Victor looked up, and for the first time fear flickered in those cold eyes. "I'm not who they think I am. I'm undercover DCPD and my cover just got blown." Sarah pulled her weapon. "Bullshit. I know every undercover in Denver." "Not this one," Victor replied, pulling out a badge with a shaking hand. "Deep Cover Federal Task Force. And if they get me, a 2-year operation dies with me." Outside, the voice continued, counting down. 90 seconds, Mr. Kincaid." James looked at Red. "Your call, cop." Red studied Victor's badge, his mind racing through possibilities. The badge looked real, but in the emergency lighting, certainty was impossible. He thought about Lila, about the torn shirt, about the cruelty in this man's eyes. "Dad," Sarah said urgently, "we need to decide." 60 seconds, the voice outside announced. Victor grabbed Red's arm. "Please, they'll torture me for names. Good cops will die." And Lila stepped forward, Nathan's jacket still draped over her shoulders. She looked Victor directly in the eyes. "Those scars you mocked my ex-husband gave them to me. Took the cops 3 years to build a case strong enough to put him away. You know what kept me alive during those 3 years?" Victor said nothing, his breath ragged. "Hope that someone somewhere would do the right thing when it mattered," Lila continued. She turned to Red. "I don't care if he's a cop or not. Nobody deserves to be tortured." 30 seconds. Red made his decision. "We hold the diner." James nodded. "Then we hold it right." The angels spread out, taking defensive positions. Sarah checked her ammunition. The trucker hefted his tire iron. Even the elderly couple armed themselves with kitchen knives. 10 seconds, Red called out through the broken window. "Come and get him." The response was immediate. The front door exploded inward, blown off its hinges by a breaching charge. Smoke grenades followed, filling the dining area with thick, impenetrable fog. Dark figures poured through, moving with tactical precision. The battle for the Red Line Diner had begun. Mike struck first, his knife finding the gap between tactical vest and hip on the first attacker through the kitchen door. The man went down, screaming, his weapon clattering across the floor. Sarah scooped it up, adding its firepower to their meager arsenal. The kitchen became a close-quarters nightmare. In the confined space, firearms were as dangerous to friends as enemies. It devolved into a brutal hand-to-hand fight, pots and pans becoming weapons, industrial equipment providing cover. James fought like a man possessed, using his chain to entangle weapons and pull attackers off balance. Nathan, younger and faster, darted between positions, striking and moving before anyone could draw a bead on him. Ray, despite his age, demonstrated why old fighters were dangerous economy of motion, striking only when necessary, every blow calculated for maximum effect. But they were outnumbered 3-1, and the attackers had come prepared. "Flashbang!" Mike shouted, recognizing the device that rolled across the floor. Everyone ducked and covered their ears, but the explosion still left them reeling, vision-starred ears ringing. In that moment of vulnerability, the attackers pressed their advantage. Sarah went down, tackled by 2 men who tried to wrestle her weapon away. She fought viciously, her training keeping her in the fight, but more kept coming. Red fired twice, dropping one of her attackers, but his ammunition was running dangerously low. Lila had retreated to the walk-in freezer, with the family barricading the door from inside, but they could hear the attackers trying to break through. The trucker stood his ground by the prep station, swinging his tire iron with desperate fury, but a taser dropped him convulsing to the floor. Just when it seemed they would be overwhelmed, Victor acted. The man everyone thought was the enemy suddenly rolled behind the attacking line, grabbed a dropped weapon, and opened fire on his supposed allies. 3 attackers went down before they realized the betrayal, their confusion buying precious seconds. "He's turned," one attacker shouted. "Kill him!" The firefight intensified, but now the dynamics had changed. Victor fought with desperate efficiency, using his knowledge of the attackers' tactics against them. He and Red ended up back-to-back, covering each other's blind spots in a dance as old as warfare itself. "You really a cop?" Red shouted over the gunfire. "Does it matter now?" Victor replied, dropping another attacker. A new sound cut through the chaos, sirens distant but growing closer. Someone had gotten through to dispatch, or the flooding had cleared enough for units to respond. The attackers heard it too, their coordinated assault beginning to falter. "Pull back," the authoritative voice commanded from outside. "Exfil in 30 seconds. The attackers began a fighting retreat, laying down suppressing fire as they backed toward the exits. But James wasn't about to let them go easily. He and Mike pursued, turning the retreat into a running battle through the destroyed dining area. In the chaos, nobody noticed one attacker break off from the main group, heading straight for the walk-in freezer where Lila and the family hid. He produced a small explosive charge, attaching it to the lock mechanism. Nathan saw him first. Without thinking, the young angel charged, tackling the man just as the charge detonated. The explosion was small, meant to breach the lock, but at point-blank range it was devastating. Nathan took the brunt of the blast, his body shielding the freezer door. "Nathan!" James roared, abandoning his pursuit to reach his fallen brother. The remaining attackers used the distraction to escape vehicles peeling out of the parking lot as sirens grew louder. In less than 30 seconds, the parking lot was empty, except for the approaching emergency vehicles. Red kicked the freezer door open, finding Lila huddled with the family, terrified but unharmed. "It's over," he said gently. "You're safe." But the cost was evident. Nathan lay unconscious, blood pooling beneath him. The elderly man had a gash on his forehead from flying debris. Sarah's arm hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. Mike pressed a bar towel to a bullet graze on his ribs. As paramedics flooded in, Victor slumped against the wall, the adrenaline finally leaving his system. Red approached him slowly, weapon lowered but not holstered. "Want to tell me what this was really about?" Red asked. Victor, if that was even his real name, laughed bitterly. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me." Before Victor could answer, Sarah's phone rang. She answered with her good arm, her face paling as she listened. "Dad," she said quietly. "That was Captain Morrison. He says the real Victor Volkov is in custody in Colorado Springs. Has been for 3 days." Everyone turned to look at the man they'd just fought to protect. He smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Like I said, you wouldn't believe me." The emergency lights flickered, casting shifting shadows across the destroyed diner. In the distance, thunder rolled across the Denver skyline, the storm moving on, but leaving devastation in its wake. The night was far from over, and the real story was just beginning to unfold. As Nathan was loaded onto a stretcher, conscious now, but weak from blood loss, he grabbed James's hand. "Did we win?" James looked around the destroyed diner, at the injured defenders, at the mystery man who might be friend or foe, at Lila standing strong despite everything she'd endured. "We survived," he said finally. "Sometimes that's the only victory that matters." Red helped Lila step over the debris. Nathan's jacket still around her shoulders like armor. She paused at the door, looking back at the ruins of what had been just hours ago, a simple diner on a stormy night. "This isn't over, is it?" she asked quietly. Red thought about lying about offering false comfort, but Lila deserved better than pretty lies. "No," he admitted. "This is just the beginning." Outside patrol cars formed a perimeter around the diner. Crime scene tape went up, transforming the Red Line from a place of refuge into evidence. Detectives began arriving, their questions adding layers to an already complex situation. Sarah, despite her broken arm, took charge of the scene with her father's same quiet authority. She pulled her captain aside, speaking in low, urgent tones. Whatever she said made him look sharply at Victor, then at Red, before calling for a federal liaison. The Hells Angels stood together, watching Nathan being loaded into an ambulance. They'd bled for strangers tonight, upheld an honor code that transcended their reputation. Mike lit a cigarette with shaking hands, the Vietnam veteran's 1,000-yard stare returning. "This reminds me of Khe Sanh," he said quietly. "Surrounded, outgunned, waiting for relief that might not come." "But we held," Ray replied, clasping his shoulder. "We held the line." James approached Red, extending a blood-stained hand. "Your diner, your call on what happens next. But my brothers and I, we're in this now, whatever this is." Red shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of an alliance he'd never expected. "I spent 23 years believing the law was enough. Tonight showed me sometimes you need something more. Sometimes you need brothers," James agreed. Victor was being led to a patrol car, cuffed despite his possible law enforcement status. As he passed Red, he stopped. "Ask about Operation Blackwater," he said quietly. "Ask why the Navarro syndicate wants this specific corner. Ask why your diner matters more than you know." Before Red could respond, Victor was pushed into the car, disappearing behind bulletproof glass and rain-streaked windows. Lila emerged from giving her statement exhausted, but unbroken. The paramedics had tried to convince her to go to the hospital for shock treatment, but she'd refused. She stood in the rain, letting it wash over her as if it could cleanse away more than just the night's violence. "I never thanked you," she said to Nathan as his stretcher passed. "For the jacket. For standing up." Nathan managed a weak smile. "You don't thank family for doing what's right." The word hung in the air, family. This ragtag group of cops, bikers, and civilians had become something more in the crucible of violence. They'd stood together when it mattered, and that created bonds that transcended their differences. Captain Morrison arrived, his presence immediately commanding attention. He surveyed the damage with calculating eyes before approaching Red. "Jack," he said, using Red's first name deliberately. "We need to talk, privately." They moved to Red's car, away from the crime scene chaos. Morrison pulled out a tablet showing Red a series of surveillance photos. "The man calling himself Victor, his real name is Thomas Keller. Ex-Special Forces went mercenary 5 years ago. He's worked for cartels, syndicates, anyone with deep pockets and shallow morals." "So he's not a cop," Red said, though he'd already suspected as much. "No, but here's where it gets interesting." Morrison swiped to a new image aerial surveillance of the diner and surrounding blocks. Your diner sits on what urban planners call a critical intersection. Control this corner, and you control trafficking routes for half of Denver's industrial district. I've owned this place for 18 months. Nobody ever, because until recently it was considered neutral ground. But something's changed. The Navarro syndicate is making moves expanding territory. Your diner is the key to their expansion. Red studied the map, his tactical mind already seeing the implications. They weren't trying to rescue Keller. They were testing our defenses. Exactly. This was a probe, see how much resistance they'd face. The fact that the Hells Angels got involved probably saved your life. The syndicate didn't expect organized opposition. What about Keller? Why the elaborate act? Morrison's expression darkened. We're not sure yet, but I can tell you this, he's connected to something bigger. Federal agencies are already circling claiming jurisdiction. This is about to get complicated. Through the rain-smeared windshield, Red could see Sarah directing the crime scene investigation despite her injury, stubborn as her father. The Angels were giving statements, their usual distrust of law enforcement temporarily set aside. Lila stood with them, no longer alone, no longer afraid. "What do you need from me, Captain?" Red asked. "Officially, stay out of it. Let us handle the investigation." And unofficially, Morrison was quiet for a long moment. The syndicate doesn't forget. They'll come back better prepared. The department's stretched thin budget cuts the flood response political pressure. We can't provide round-the-clock protection. You're saying I'm on my own? I'm saying sometimes the system needs help from outside the system. Morrison glanced meaningfully at the Hells Angels. Sometimes badges and patches need to work together even if nobody admits it officially. The implications were staggering. A retired cop and active detective partnering with an outlaw motorcycle club to defend against a criminal syndicate, it was the kind of alliance that could never be officially sanctioned, but might be the only thing standing between order and chaos. Red made his decision. I need to know everything. The syndicate, Keller, why my diner? Everything. Morrison handed him a flash drive. That's all we have. Jack, be careful. You're walking into a gray area that could destroy everything you've built, everything you've stood for. My principles haven't changed, Red replied. Protect and serve. The badge might be retired, but the oath isn't. As Morrison left, Red returned to the diner's ruins. The storm was finally breaking weak sunlight, beginning to pierce the clouds. It illuminated the devastation, but also the people standing strong despite it. James approached his brothers, flanking him. We need to talk about what comes next. Yes, Red agreed. We do. Sarah joined them, her broken arm in a sling, but her resolve intact. Dad, I've been thinking. This syndicate, they made a mistake tonight. How do you figure they brought violence to neutral ground? They threatened civilians. They united people who should be natural enemies. She looked at the Angels, then back at her father. They created the exact alliance they should fear most. Lila stepped forward, still wearing Nathan's jacket. I want to help. I know I'm just a waitress, but you're not just anything, James interrupted. You're a survivor. That means something. The elderly couple who'd refused to leave approached. We've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, the man said. We've watched it change, not always for the better. But tonight we saw something we haven't seen in decades, people standing up for each other. His wife nodded. The diner's always been more than just a place to eat. It's been a safe haven. We won't let them take that away. The trucker ice pack pressed to his head from the taser. Hit joined the growing circle. I drive routes all over the country. I can spread the word, let other drivers know what happened here. The syndicate wants to use these roads. They'll find a lot of eyes watching. It was happening organically, a community response to a threat that endangered them all. Red felt something he hadn't experienced since his best days on the force, hope that ordinary people could make an extraordinary difference. "If we do this," Red said carefully, "we do it right. No vigilante justice, no revenge. We defend, we protect, we gather intelligence. We work with law enforcement when possible around them, when necessary. Everyone agrees to that, or this ends now." One by one, they nodded agreement. Even the Angels men who lived outside society's normal rules understood the necessity of boundaries. "There's something else." Victor/Keller's voice came from behind them. He stood between two federal agents, still cuffed, but no longer heading to a patrol car. "You're going to need my help." "Like hell," Sarah spat. "Listen to him," one of the federal agents said, displaying FBI credentials. "Mr. Keller has agreed to cooperate in exchange for certain considerations." "I know the Navarro Syndicate's playbook," Keller said. "I know their operations, their weaknesses. You survived tonight because they underestimated you. That won't happen twice." "You tore my shirt," Lila said quietly, stepping forward. "You humiliated me. Why should we trust anything you say?" Keller met her gaze without flinching. "Because I needed to establish credibility with the syndicate. They were watching, testing me. If I hadn't played the role perfectly, they would have killed me on the spot. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm offering information that could save lives." "He's telling the truth about one thing," the FBI agent confirmed. "The syndicate had eyes on the diner. This was orchestrated from the beginning." Red studied Keller, seeing past the swagger to something else. Desperation, maybe even fear. "What's your real story? Not the cover, not the lies. The truth." Keller was quiet for a moment. "My sister disappeared 3 years ago. The Navarro Syndicate was involved. I've spent 3 years working my way inside, gaining their trust, getting close to answers. Your diner was supposed to be my final test before they brought me into the inner circle." "So you used us," James said coldly. "Yes. But when the plan changed, when they decided to actually attack civilians instead of just intimidating them, I had a choice. I chose to blow my cover and help. 3 years of work gone because I couldn't watch innocent people die." The group absorbed this information, weighing truth against deception, trust against necessity. Finally, Red spoke. "You get one chance. One. You provide intelligence, nothing more. You don't make decisions, you don't take action without approval. And if you betray us, the syndicate will be the least of your problems." Keller nodded. "Understood." The federal agents led him away, but not before he called back. "They'll come at night, within the week. 50 men, maybe more. They want to make an example that will echo through the entire region." As the crime scene began to clear, the core group remained. They stood in the ruins of the Red Line Diner, understanding that they were at a crossroads. The easy path would be to walk away to let others handle the threat. But the easy path had never been their way. "So," James said, lighting another cigarette, "we're really doing this, cops and angels working together." "Looks like it," Red replied. "Hell of a thing," Mike mused. "Vietnam, I fought beside men I'd never have talked to back home. Shared danger has a way of erasing boundaries." Ray checked his phone. "Nathan's stable. Surgery went well. He's asking about everyone." "Tell him we're handling it," James said. Then to Red, "We'll need a place to coordinate. The diner's compromised." "I've got a basement," the elderly man offered. "Built it as a bomb shelter in the 60s. Never thought I'd actually need it." Sarah pulled out her phone, already making lists. "I can get us communication equipment, surveillance gear. Off the books, but legal. I know some drivers who can help with reconnaissance," the trucker added. "We see everything on these roads and we talk to each other." Lila stood quietly, absorbing the moment. Then she spoke with unexpected steel in her voice. My ex-husband is in prison because I testified against him. It took everything I had to stand up in that courtroom and speak the truth. I won't let fear win again. Whatever you need, I'm in. The sun broke fully through the clouds, now bathing the destroyed diner in golden light. It felt like a sign, though Red had never been one for mysticism. Sometimes, though, the universe seemed to acknowledge moments of significance. All right, Red said, assuming the natural leadership that decades of command had ingrained. We prepare, we plan, we protect. The Navarro syndicate thinks they're dealing with a soft target. They're about to learn otherwise. As the group dispersed to begin preparations, each carrying new responsibilities and unlikely alliances, Red remained behind with Sarah. Father and daughter stood in the wreckage, both injured, both unbowed. Mom would have been proud, Sarah said quietly. You're still protecting people, just differently. She would have been terrified, Red corrected with a sad smile. But yes, also proud. This could end badly, Dad. The syndicate has resources we can't match. Maybe, but they don't have what we have. Which is? Red looked at the disparate group of people who'd chosen to stand together. Bikers, cops, civilians, even a reformed mercenary. Something worth fighting for. Each other. The Red Line Diner's neon sign, miraculously undamaged, flickered back to life as someone inside found the right circuit breaker. It cast its red glow across the morning shadows, a beacon that refused to be extinguished. The battle for the diner was over. The war for the neighborhood was about to begin. The basement beneath Harold and Martha Brennan's modest two-story home hadn't seen this much activity since 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis had the whole neighborhood convinced nuclear war was imminent. Now, 63 years later, Harold watched as his Cold War bunker transformed into a command center for a very different kind of conflict. Red descended the wooden stairs, his boots echoing in the concrete chamber. The space was larger than expected. Harold had done his homework during the atomic age. Metal shelving lined the walls stocked with canned goods that were probably older than some of the angels. A ham radio setup occupied one corner, its dials and switches looking like something from a museum. Still works, Harold said, noticing Red's interest. Check in with other operators twice a week. You'd be surprised how much information travels on amateur frequencies. Sarah followed her broken arm, making the descent awkward. She carried a duffel bag filled with equipment borrowed from the Denver PD evidence room, communication devices from drug busts, surveillance cameras from closed cases, gear that wouldn't be missed for a few days. James arrived with Mike and Ray, having left Nathan recovering at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital with strict orders to stay put. The hospital staff had been told Nathan was a construction worker injured in a scaffolding collapse. The truth would raise too many questions. How's he doing? Red asked. Pissed off that he's missing the planning session, James replied. But alive. The doc says he'll be back on his feet in a week, assuming he follows orders. Nathan following orders? Ray snorted. That'll be the day. Lila entered last, carrying coffee in a thermal carafe and wearing the same clothes from the night before. She hadn't gone home, couldn't bring herself to be alone in her apartment after what had happened. Instead, she'd spent the early morning hours at the hospital, sitting with Nathan while his brothers caught a few hours of sleep. Any word from the FBI? Red asked Sarah. Agent Parker called an hour ago. Keller's been processed through federal custody. They're setting up a safe house for debriefing, but he keeps asking to speak with us. Let him ask, James said coldly. Man's got blood to account for before we trust him with anything important. Harold spread a large map of the industrial district across a folding table, the paper crackling with age. Red recognized the topographical detail. This wasn't a consumer map, but something military-grade, probably obtained through Harold's connections as a former Army Corps of Engineers contractor. "Show me where they'll come from," Red said. Sarah pulled out her laptop, connecting it to a portable projector that cast satellite imagery onto the basement's white-painted wall. The Red Line Diner sat at the intersection of three major corridors, Interstate 70 to the North Highway 287 running south, and the industrial railway that paralleled Platte River Road. Classic choke point. Mike observed his Vietnam experience, reading the terrain like a book. Control this intersection, and you control everything that moves through this part of the city. Keller said 50 men, Red mused, studying approach routes. That's not a raid, that's an occupation force. Martha descended the stairs, carrying sandwiches, her silver hair pinned back in a way that reminded everyone she'd been a Rosie the Riveter during World War II. At 87, she moved with the purposeful efficiency of someone who'd lived through rationing air raid drills and 6 decades of marriage to a man who prepared for everything. "You boys need to eat," she said firmly, setting down the tray. "Can't fight on empty stomachs." The simple gesture food offered without expectation of payment or thanks crystallized something for the group. This wasn't just about the diner anymore. It was about community, about people like Harold and Martha who'd invested their lives in this neighborhood. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. She read it, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "Dad, we've got a problem. Captain Morrison wants to see me downtown, now." "What kind of problem?" Red asked. "The kind where the FBI starts asking why a Denver detective was involved in an off-duty firefight with federal witnesses." Sarah gathered her gear. "I need to go. If this goes sideways—" "It won't," Red interrupted. "You were investigating reports of disturbance at your father's business. Everything else was self-defense." "That's the story I'm sticking to," Sarah agreed. "But Dad, if they suspend me, if they take my badge, then you'll still be my daughter and this will still be the right thing to do." Sarah hugged him awkwardly with her good arm, then headed upstairs. The sound of her car starting and pulling away left an uncomfortable silence in the basement. "She's putting her career on the line," Lila observed quietly. "Everyone is," James replied. "Question is whether we're worth it." Harold activated his ham radio, adjusting dials until voices crackled through static. "KD0ABC, this is WBB0XYZ. Do you copy?" After a moment, a response came through clear. "Bill, it's Harold. I need you to reach out to the network. We're looking for eyes on unusual activity in the industrial corridor. Truckers, delivery drivers, anyone who works the roads regular." The ham radio network, Red realized, was Harold's version of intelligence gathering. Operators across the city connected by radio waves and decades of friendship sharing information that never made it into official channels. Within minutes, reports started coming in. Unusual convoy spotted on I-70 eastbound exit 275. Military-style vehicles, no markings. Surveillance van parked on Platte River Road for 3 hours. Occupants using binoculars. Construction crew working after hours near the railway junction. No permits filed with city planning. The pattern emerged quickly. The Navarro syndicate wasn't waiting a week. They were positioning assets, now establishing overwatch, preparing for a coordinated assault. Ray's phone rang. He answered, listening intently before hanging up with a grim expression. "That was my contact at the freight yards. 3 boxcars were moved to a siding near the diner during the night shift. No manifests, no scheduled pickup. They're just sitting there." "Staging area," Mike said immediately. "Classic military doctrine. Pre-position supplies and personnel, then execute rapid deployment." Red felt the familiar tactical alertness that had kept him alive during 2 decades of police work. "How long do we have?" Before anyone could answer, footsteps thundered down the basement stairs. Nathan appeared pale but mobile, wearing hospital scrubs and a determined expression. Behind him came two men Red didn't recognize angels from other chapters, judging by their cuts. "Nathan, what the hell are you doing out of the hospital?" James demanded. "Doc says I can walk, so I'm walking. Besides, word's spreading through the network. We've got brothers coming in from Colorado Springs and Grand Junction." Nathan gestured to the two men behind him. "Meet Tommy and Snake. They volunteer for search and rescue in the mountains. Know a thing or two about defensive positions." Tommy stepped forward, a bear of a man with scars that spoke of serious outdoor accidents. "We've been tracking radio chatter. Whatever's coming, it's bigger than 50 men. Try 200. The basement suddenly felt smaller, the concrete walls seeming to press inward. 200 was an army, not a strike force. It was the kind of numbers that suggested the Navarro syndicate intended to make a statement that would echo across the entire criminal underworld. "We're outgunned," Red stated the obvious. "Maybe," Snake replied. His lean frame and calculating eyes suggested military background. "But we're not outthought. They're planning a conventional assault on what they think is a soft target. They don't know we're ready." Martha appeared at the top of the stairs. "Harold, you need to see the news." They climbed up to find the television tuned to local coverage. A reporter stood outside the federal building, downtown, microphone in hand, as she delivered breaking news. Sources confirm that last night's incident at the Red Line Diner is connected to a larger federal investigation into organized crime activities in the Denver metro area. Detective Sarah Kincaid, daughter of the diner's owner, has been placed on administrative leave pending an internal affairs investigation. Red's hands clenched into fists. "They're isolating us, removing official support." The report continued. "The FBI has taken over the investigation, citing concerns about local law enforcement's ability to handle the complexity of the case." James lit a cigarette, his movement sharp with anger. "They're cutting us loose, making sure when the syndicate comes we're on our own." "No," Harold said quietly. "They're making sure when we fight back there's no official connection to the department. Sometimes the system protects itself by looking the other way." Lila moved to the window, peering through curtains at the street beyond. "There's a van that wasn't there an hour ago. 2 men inside watching the house." Everyone froze. Red moved to another window, confirming Lila's observation. The surveillance was casual, but professional, the kind of overwatch that preceded action. "They found us fast," Tommy observed. "Too fast," Ray agreed. "Someone gave them this address." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Either they'd been sloppy in their operational security, or someone was feeding information to the syndicate. Red's mind raced through possibilities. Keller, despite his apparent cooperation, remained the most likely source. Snake was already moving, pulling equipment from a backpack that seemed military issue. "We need to relocate. This position is compromised." "Where?" James asked. "They'll track us anywhere we go." "Not anywhere," Harold said, moving to an old filing cabinet. He pulled out blueprints, yellowed with age. "Denver's underground steam tunnel system, built in the 1920s, expanded during World War II. Most of it's been forgotten, but the tunnels still connect every major building in the industrial district." Red studied the blueprints, seeing possibilities. "Including the diner." "Especially the diner. The tunnel entrance is hidden in the basement behind the water heater. I helped design the connections when I worked for the city engineering department." Martha packed supplies with practiced efficiency while the men planned their underground relocation. She'd lived through enough crises to know that survival often depended on the boring details: food, water, first aid supplies, batteries for flashlights. "How do we get there without being seen?" Nathan asked, wincing as he moved too quickly. "We don't all go at once," Snake replied. "Classic evasion protocol. Staggered departures, different routes meet at the objective." Red's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Internal Affairs wants everything. They know about the angels, about the Alliance. Someone's talking. He showed the message to James, who cursed under his breath. If they've got our communications compromised. Then we go dark, Red interrupted. No phones, no radios. Old school coordination from here on. The surveillance van hadn't moved, but Red noticed a second vehicle had appeared at the opposite end of the street. The watchers were being watched and probably reporting everything they observed. Time was running out faster than anticipated. Harold disappeared into a closet, emerging with items that seemed out of place in a suburban home. Night vision goggles, tactical flashlights, military-grade communication headsets. Martha watched with the expression of a woman long accustomed to her husband's preparedness obsessions. "Harold," she said patiently, "you can't take all of that." "The hell I can't. Bought this gear with my own money, stored it in my own house. If the government won't protect our neighborhood, then I will." The old man's transformation was startling. The mild-mannered retiree had become something harder, more focused. Red recognized the change. It was what happened when good people decided they'd had enough of being victims. Tommy checked his watch. "We need to move. Pattern of life surveillance suggests shift changes every 4 hours. Next rotation is in 20 minutes. They divided into 3 groups. Harold and Martha would remain at the house, maintaining normal routines while monitoring radio traffic. Nathan would go with Snake through the backyards, using his injury as cover for moving slowly and carefully. Red James, Mike, Ray, Tommy, and Lila would take the most direct route through the tunnel system. "What about Keller?" Lila asked as they prepared to leave. "What about him?" James replied coldly. "He said they'd come at night. If he's right, we have maybe 6 hours to prepare. If he's wrong, or if he's feeding them information about our plans, then we adapt," Red finished. "It's what we do." The basement seemed smaller as they gathered their gear, each person checking weapons communication equipment and supplies. The camaraderie that had formed during the diner fight was evolving into something more professional, more focused. They were becoming a unit. Harold led them to a concealed door behind the furnace, revealing a tunnel entrance that hadn't been opened in decades. The air that emerged was stale but breathable, carrying the faint scent of old machinery and forgotten spaces. Tunnel runs 800 yards northeast surfaces in the diner's basement. Side passages connect to the railway maintenance shed, the power substation, and the old brewery warehouse. Harold handed Red a hand-drawn map. "Stay on the main passage. Some of the side tunnels have cave-ins." Red took point flashlight, cutting through darkness that seemed absolute. Behind him, the others moved in tactical formation weapons, ready, nerves tight with anticipation. The tunnel was wider than expected, built to accommodate steam pipes that had long since been removed. 50 yards in, Red raised his hand, stopping the column. Voices echoed from somewhere ahead, not from their destination, but from one of the side passages. Someone else was in the tunnels. James moved up, listening intently. 3 voices, maybe 4, moving toward us. They had seconds to decide, continue forward and risk contact, or retreat and abandon their plan. Red chose a third option, leading the group into an alcove that had once housed pressure gauges, motioning for absolute silence. The voices grew closer, speaking a language Red didn't recognize, but which sounded Eastern European. Flashlight beams swept the main tunnel, missing their hiding spot by inches. The speakers passed without detecting them, but their presence confirmed Red's worst fears. The syndicate was already using the tunnel system. "They know about the underground," Mike whispered once the voices faded. "Keller," Ray said, stating what everyone was thinking. The betrayal was almost complete now. The federal witness who'd claimed to help them had provided the syndicate with detailed intelligence about their capabilities, their plans, and now their escape routes. They were walking into a trap that had been carefully prepared using their own information. Red made a command decision. We continue to the diner, but we assume it's compromised. This becomes a reconnaissance mission, not a base establishment. They moved faster now, the urgency of their situation driving them forward through the claustrophobic darkness. The tunnel began to slope upward, indicating they were approaching the diner's elevation. Red could hear the faint hum of electrical equipment, suggesting they were near the building's basement. The tunnel ended at a heavy door marked with warnings about electrical hazards. Red tried the handle, slowly finding it unlocked. Beyond lay the diner's basement, illuminated by emergency lighting that cast everything in red shadows. But they weren't alone. Thomas Keller sat calmly at Red's desk, feet propped up casually as if he owned the place. Behind him stood two men in tactical gear, weapons drawn but not yet aimed. The setup spoke of confidence. They'd been expecting this exact scenario. "Right on time," Keller said with genuine amusement. The tunnel route was always the most logical choice. "I'm actually impressed you made it this far without triggering the motion sensors." "Motion sensors?" Lila asked, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Oh yes, we've been tracking you since you left Harold's basement. The old man's tunnel maps were quite helpful, by the way. Amazing what people will tell you when they think you're on their side." James started to raise his weapon, but stopped when laser sights appeared on his chest. More tactical team members emerged from concealment, at least 6 that Red could count, probably more positioned out of sight. "Now, before anyone does anything dramatic," Keller continued conversationally, "let me explain how this is going to work. You're all going to put down your weapons and walk upstairs. Then we're going to have a conversation about cooperation versus resistance." "Go to hell," Ray said flatly. "Eventually, perhaps. But first we're going to discuss the future of this neighborhood. You see, the Navarro Syndicate has invested considerable resources in establishing operations here. Your little resistance group represents a threat to that investment." Red studied the tactical situation, calculating odds, and finding them universally poor. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in a confined space with limited exits. But surrender wasn't an option, it never had been. "What happened to your sister?" Red asked suddenly. The question caught Keller off guard, his casual demeanor flickering for just a moment. "What? Your sister? The one who disappeared? The reason you said you infiltrated the syndicate? What really happened to her?" Keller's composure returned, but Red had seen the crack in the facade. "Ancient history. People disappear. Life moves on." "Bullshit," Lila said quietly. "Nobody goes through 3 years of undercover work for ancient history. She's still out there, isn't she? Still being held by the syndicate." The laser sights wavered slightly as Keller's men reacted to their leader's obvious discomfort with the line of questioning. Red pressed the advantage. "They've got leverage on you. Your sister's life in exchange for delivering us. That's why you're here, why you helped set this up. They're making you choose." "Enough," Keller snapped, his mask finally dropping. "You don't know anything about—" An explosion somewhere above them cut off his words, the building shaking as dust rained from the ceiling. Emergency alarms began wailing and the lights flickered before switching to battery backup. "What the hell was that?" one of the tactical team members demanded. Before Keller could answer, gunfire erupted from the diner's main floor. Not the controlled bursts of professional operators, but the rapid-fire chaos of a firefight in progress. Someone was attacking the diner, but it wasn't the syndicate force they'd been expecting. Through the confusion, Red heard something that made his heart race, the distinctive roar of motorcycle engines, lots of them getting closer fast. "The cavalry," James said with grim satisfaction, "has arrived." The basement door burst open and Nathan appeared at the top of the stairs, no longer wearing hospital scrubs, but full tactical gear. Behind him came angels. Red had never seen before men from chapters across Colorado called to arms by the Brotherhood's ancient codes of loyalty and mutual protection. The tactical team members spun to face this new threat, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into chaos. In that moment of confusion, Red's group struck. Mike, despite his age, moved like the combat veteran he was, tackling the nearest gunman with techniques learned in Southeast Asian jungles. Ray and Tommy flanked left and right, using their size and reach to devastating effect. James went straight for Keller, decades of street fighting experience guiding his attack. But it was Lila who provided the decisive action. Instead of taking cover like everyone expected, she lunged for the electrical panel, yanking the main breaker and plunging the basement into complete darkness. In the pitch-black chaos that followed, training and instinct took over. Red moved by sound and memory, using his knowledge of the basement's layout to navigate, while the syndicate's people struggled with unfamiliar territory. The Angels, accustomed to fighting in bars and back alleys, where visibility was often poor, adapted faster than their opponents. When Nathan's tactical lights finally illuminated the basement, the fight was over. The syndicate's tactical team was down, either unconscious or restrained. Keller sat against the wall, blood running from his nose, looking more defeated than injured. "How many more upstairs?" Red demanded. "The diner's secure," Nathan reported. "But we've got bigger problems. Snake's monitoring radio traffic from the surveillance teams. They're calling in reinforcements, serious reinforcements, military contractors, not just syndicate soldiers." The implication was staggering. The Navarro syndicate had escalated beyond criminal enterprise into something approaching private warfare. They were bringing mercenaries to bear against American civilians on American soil. Red knelt beside Keller, seeing past the deception to the desperation underneath. "Talk to me about your sister. Real talk, no more games." Keller's resistance finally cracked completely. "Elena, she's 16. They took her from our apartment in Chicago 3 years ago. They've been using her as leverage ever since, moving me from job to job, making me do things." His voice broke. "She calls me once a month. They let her say just enough to prove she's alive." "Where is she?" "I don't know. They never tell me locations, never let me see her. Just the monthly calls, just enough hope to keep me obedient." Lila sat beside Keller, her expression softening with understanding. "The scars you saw, the ones you mocked, they didn't break me because I had people who refused to let me stay broken. Your sister has you. That's her strength." "I've betrayed everyone who tried to help me," Keller said, "including you. The syndicate knows about this tunnel, about Harold's house, about your plans. I gave them everything." "Then help us take it back," Red said simply. "Help us end this." "You don't understand. They have resources you can't imagine. Private military companies, political connections, judges on the payroll. Fighting them is suicide." Nathan descended the stairs, carrying communication equipment. "Maybe, but we've got something they don't expect. Which is, the entire Colorado Angels Confederation is rolling toward Denver. Every chapter, every affiliated club, every brother who ever wore a patch. We're talking about 500 bikers, and they're bringing friends." And the scope of the response was breathtaking. Word had spread through the biker community's informal networks, carried by riders who understood that an attack on one chapter was an attack on all. Veterans organizations, motorcycle clubs that weren't technically angels, but shared similar values, all were converging on Denver with a singular purpose. "It's not enough," Keller said. "The syndicate has been planning this for months. They have heavy weapons, explosives, tactical air support." "Tactical air support," Mike interrupted, "on American soil. Private contractors don't follow the same rules. They've used helicopter gunships in Mexico, Colombia, anywhere local authorities can be bought or intimidated." Red absorbed this information, his tactical mind already adapting to the new parameters. Nathan, get on the radio to Snake. I need to know everything: vehicle count, weapons signatures, approach routes. This isn't just about defending the diner anymore. What's it about? Lila asked. Red looked around at the unlikely alliance that had formed in his basement: retired cops and active bikers, waitresses and federal witnesses, elderly couples and military veterans. They represented something the syndicate couldn't buy or intimidate ordinary Americans who'd decided to stand their ground. It's about proving that some things can't be conquered by money and fear, Red said. It's about showing them that democracy isn't just a word, it's something people will fight for. Upstairs, the sound of motorcycle engines grew louder, joined by the rumble of trucks and the distinctive whine of high-performance cars. The cavalry was arriving, and it was larger than anyone had imagined. The final battle for the Red Line Diner, and perhaps for the soul of the neighborhood, was about to begin. But first, they had to survive the next few hours, and Thomas Keller's intelligence suggested that would be far more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The Navarro Syndicate wasn't just coming to make a point. They were coming to make an example that would echo across the entire American criminal underground. Red checked his weapon one final time, looked around at the faces of people who'd chosen to stand with him despite the odds, and prepared for the fight of his life. The war had come home, and home was going to fight back. The rumble of approaching engines grew into a thunderous symphony that shook the diner's windows and rattled the coffee cups, still sitting on abandoned tables. Through the front windows, Red could see headlights cutting through the afternoon gloom, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, forming a river of chrome and steel that flowed down the industrial corridor like a mechanical migration. Snake's voice crackled over the radio from his overwatch position atop the old brewery. "Holy shit, Red, you need to see this. We've got angels from as far as New Mexico rolling in, banditos from Texas, even some outlaws from Chicago. This isn't just Colorado anymore, this is national." Nathan limped to the window, his face pale, but his eyes bright with something that might have been wonder. "Word must have spread through the networks. Attack one club, you attack them all. It's the oldest rule in the book." But Keller's intelligence about the syndicate's resources weighed heavily on Red's mind. 500 bikers, even armed bikers, wouldn't stand long against military contractors with helicopter support and heavy weapons. This was shaping up to be a massacre, not a rescue. "We need to spread them out," Red said, studying the tactical situation through the diner's bullet-starred windows. "Concentrated like this, they're sitting ducks for air support." James was already on his radio coordinating with chapter presidents from across the region. "Echo 7, this is Denver 1. We need perimeter positions, not a parade ground. Split your people into defensive teams and take positions in the industrial buildings. Make them fight for every block." The response was immediate. The river of motorcycles began branching into smaller streams, riders peeling off to occupy the abandoned factories' rail yards and warehouse complexes that surrounded the diner. Within minutes, the open ground that had been perfect for helicopter attack runs was filled with covered positions and potential ambush sites. Martha Brennan's voice came through on Harold's ham radio frequency, her elderly tones carrying clearly despite the static. "WD0XYZ, this is KDOABC. We're monitoring emergency service frequencies. Denver PD has cordoned off a 6-block radius around your position. They're treating this as a federal operation now." "Meaning?" Red asked. Harold adjusted the radio's gain, clearing the signal. "Meaning officially whatever happens in here stays in here. No municipal response, no backup, no witnesses." The implications hit everyone simultaneously. The system had written them off, creating a free fire zone where the syndicate could operate without fear of legal consequence. It was exactly the kind of official abandonment that preceded atrocities. Lila moved away from the window, her hands shaking as she poured coffee with mechanical precision. "My ex-husband used to threaten me like this. Said nobody would help, nobody would care that I was alone." She set down the pot with deliberate control. "I'm not alone anymore." Tommy's radio crackled with reports from the defensive positions. "Movement on the south approach. Convoy of black SUVs military pattern. Count 12 vehicles, probably 6 personnel each." "North approach shows similar," Ray added from his position. "These aren't street thugs. Coordinated military movement, professional spacing." Red felt the familiar pre-combat tension, the sharpening of focus that came when violence became inevitable. But this was different from his police days. Then he'd fought to maintain order. Now he was part of the chaos, a civilian defender in what amounted to a small war. Mike's voice came through with Vietnam-era calm. "Contact. South perimeter. They're probing our positions with small teams." The sharp crack of rifle fire punctuated his words, followed by the deeper boom of shotguns as the Angels engaged. Red could see muzzle flashes from the warehouse windows, brief sparks in the gathering dusk that marked the beginning of the battle. "Casualty report," James demanded. "One of theirs down, visible on the approach road. Our people are holding position." But even as Mike spoke, a new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive whine of turbine engines approaching fast and low. Red's blood chilled as he recognized the sound from military documentaries and news reports from overseas conflicts. "Helicopter inbound," Snake reported with professional calm. "Apache-class attack bird coming in from the northeast." The aircraft appeared over the railway yard, a dark silhouette against the storm clouds bristling with weapons pods and sensor arrays. It was military hardware being used on American soil against American citizens, a line that shouldn't have been crossable. "Everyone down!" Red shouted, as the helicopter's nose cannon began rotating toward the diner. The first burst tore through the front wall, high-velocity rounds punching fist-sized holes through brick and mortar. The carefully maintained normalcy of the diner, the chrome stools, the checked floor, the vintage photographs disintegrated under military-grade firepower. But the Angels were already responding. From concealed positions throughout the industrial complex, small arms fire reached up toward the aircraft. Individual rifles might not penetrate helicopter armor, but concentrated fire from dozens of weapons created a wall of lead that forced the pilot to maneuver defensively. More critically, some of the bikers had come prepared for exactly this scenario. Red heard the distinctive whoosh of a rocket-propelled grenade launching from one of the warehouse positions, followed by a brilliant flash as it detonated near the helicopter's tail rotor. The aircraft spun violently, auto-rotating toward an emergency landing in the rail yard. Its crew would survive, but the syndicate's decisive air superiority had lasted less than 3 minutes against prepared defenders. "Scratch one gunship," Tommy reported with satisfaction. "But we've got bigger problems. Ground assault is beginning on all approaches." Through the shattered windows, Red could see tactical teams advancing with professional precision, using vehicles and terrain for cover as they closed the distance. The syndicate had learned from the previous night's mistakes. No more single points of entry. No more underestimation of resistance. Keller struggled to his feet, his face grim with knowledge of what was coming. "The helicopter was just reconnaissance," he said. "They're calling in the real firepower now." "What real firepower?" Nathan demanded. "Military contractors don't just rent helicopters. They have access to artillery drone strikes, weapons that can level city blocks." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Red realized they weren't just fighting a criminal organization. They were up against a private army with resources that rivaled some national militaries. Sarah's voice crackled over Red's radio transmitted from an unknown location. "Dad, I'm monitoring federal frequencies. There's chatter about an urban warfare exercise authorized for your location. They're providing legal cover for whatever's about to happen. The betrayal was complete now. The system that Red had served for 23 years was actively facilitating an attack on civilians. The syndicate hadn't just bought criminals, they'd bought legitimacy. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Red heard something that rekindled hope, the sound of heavy engines approaching from multiple directions, different from the syndicate's tactical vehicles. Through the smoke and chaos, he saw them 18-wheelers construction equipment, municipal vehicles marked with various city and county insignia. Harold's voice came through on the radio, his elderly tones carrying new authority. "Red, this is WB0XYZ. The truckers' network heard about the federal designation. They're not buying it. We've got independent contractors rolling in to perform emergency road maintenance in your area." The trucks formed a defensive perimeter, their massive bulk creating barriers that would force the syndicate's ground assault to funnel through predictable choke points. But more importantly, they brought something the defenders desperately needed: legitimacy. Municipal contractors performing emergency work had a legal right to be present, complicating the syndicate's free-fire authorization. James coordinated with the new arrivals, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to organizing complex operations. "Truckers take the outer perimeter. Angels hold the buildings. Everyone else stay mobile and ready to reinforce where needed." The battle evolved into a complex urban engagement with both sides maneuvering for advantage among the industrial landscape. The syndicate's superior firepower was partially offset by the defenders' knowledge of local terrain and their ability to blend legitimate activities with defensive preparations. But the cost was becoming apparent. Casualty reports filtered in from the defensive positions, Angels wounded truckers pinned down civilian contractors caught in crossfire. The romance of standing up to evil was colliding with the brutal mathematics of modern warfare. Lila worked frantically to establish a medical station in the diner's back room, using supplies Martha had provided and skills learned from mandatory first aid training. Her hands remained steady, despite the gunfire outside her focus, absolute, as she prepared to treat wounded defenders. "How long can we hold?" she asked Red during a brief lull in the fighting. "As long as we have to," he replied, though privately he wondered if they had hours or minutes before being overwhelmed. The answer came sooner than expected. Snake's urgent voice cut through the radio chatter. "Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. This isn't Syndicate, these are federal agents, FBI markings coming in fast." Red felt a surge of hope. Perhaps the system hadn't abandoned them completely. Perhaps Sarah had gotten through to someone with the authority to stop this madness. The federal convoy entered the combat zone with lights flashing and sirens wailing, forcing both sides to temporarily cease fire. Agent Parker emerged from the lead vehicle megaphone in hand. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation," his amplified voice echoed across the industrial complex. "All parties will lay down weapons and submit to federal authority immediately." For a moment, Red allowed himself to believe rescue had arrived. Then he noticed the positioning of the federal vehicles. They weren't establishing a neutral zone between combatants. They were surrounding the defenders' positions while leaving the syndicate's assault teams untouched. The betrayal was perfect in its audacity. The FBI wasn't stopping the attack, they were facilitating it under color of law. James recognized the trap immediately. "All units, this is Denver 1. Federal agents are compromised. Treat them as hostile until proven otherwise." The Angels and their allies shifted positions, now facing threats from multiple directions. The Syndicate's ground assault, the remaining air assets, and a federal law enforcement agency that had apparently been bought or coerced into cooperation. Parker's voice continued through the megaphone. "Surrender now and face legal proceedings, or continue resistance and face the consequences of armed insurrection against federal authority." "Federal authority, my ass." Ray muttered, adjusting his rifle's scope. "This is corruption wearing a badge." But even as the defenders prepared for a last stand, a new element entered the equation. Harold's ham radio crackled with excited voices from operators across the region. "Traffic, traffic, traffic," came the alert. "This is KDZR-DEF monitoring federal frequencies. FBI Denver Field Office is reporting an unauthorized operation using their credentials. They're dispatching legitimate agents to investigate." The confusion multiplied as additional federal vehicles arrived, these bearing different markings and approaching from different directions. Parker's compromised team found themselves surrounded by their own agency, their illegal operation exposed by the very communication networks they'd tried to control. In the chaos of conflicting federal authorities, the syndicate's assault faltered. Their legal cover evaporated as legitimate FBI agents began arresting their corrupt colleagues. The private military contractors found themselves engaged not with civilian resistors, but with federal law enforcement officers acting under proper authority. The tide of battle shifted decisively. Syndicate forces began withdrawing their carefully planned operation, dissolving into a desperate retreat. The private contractors melted away like shadows, their expensive equipment abandoned as they fled to avoid federal detention. But victory came at a cost. The diner was destroyed, its walls pocked with bullet holes, its windows shattered, its interior devastated by military-grade weapons. The defenders had held their ground, but the ground itself bore scars that would take years to heal. As federal agents processed the crime scene and arrested syndicate operatives, Red surveyed the aftermath. Nathan sat propped against an overturned table, his earlier injury aggravated by the night's fighting, but his spirit unbroken. Mike and Ray tended to wounded angels, their Vietnam medical training proving invaluable. Tommy and Snake coordinated with legitimate federal agents, providing intelligence that would help dismantle the syndicate's broader operations. Lila stood in the ruins of what had been her workplace, her face streaked with dust and exhaustion, but her posture straight and defiant. "We won," she said quietly. "Did we?" Red asked, looking at the devastation. "We're alive. They're not. The neighborhood is safe. That's winning." Agent Parker, the real Agent Parker, not the corrupted version, approached Red with a mixture of respect and bewilderment. "Mr. Kincaid, I need to understand what happened here. The reports we're getting suggest a private military operation on American soil." Red considered his answer carefully. "Federal witness Thomas Keller can provide details about syndicate operations. The rest is self-defense against criminal attack. Criminal attack involving helicopter gunships and military contractors. The criminal justice system will have to determine appropriate charges," Red replied, with the diplomatic skill learned during 2 decades of writing police reports. Parker studied the scene, taking in the defensive positions, the coordinated resistance, the civilian contractors who'd risked their lives to support law enforcement. "This shouldn't have been necessary. The system should have protected you." "The system tried to sacrifice us," James interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd seen government betrayal before. "Good thing we had alternatives." As the sun set behind the Denver skyline, casting long shadows across the industrial district, the scope of what had occurred became clear. A criminal syndicate had attempted to establish territorial control through military-style assault. They'd been defeated not by government forces, but by civilian resistance bikers, truckers, retirees, and ordinary citizens who'd refused to submit to criminal authority. The implications would echo through law enforcement and criminal organizations for years to come. The Navarro Syndicate's humiliating defeat would serve as a warning to other groups considering similar territorial expansion. More importantly, the successful civilian resistance would inspire communities facing their own criminal infiltration. But for Red, the victory felt incomplete. The diner was destroyed. His community traumatized, his faith in official institutions shattered. He'd learned that sometimes the badge wasn't enough, that sometimes ordinary citizens had to become extraordinary defenders. Keller approached as federal agents prepared to transport him for debriefing. "Thank you," he said simply, "for giving me the chance to do the right thing." "Your sister?" Red asked. "Any word? The FBI thinks they've identified her location. There's going to be a rescue operation." Keller's voice carried hope for the first time since Red had met him. "She might actually be free." As darkness fell over the Denver Industrial District, the defenders began the long process of accounting for their actions and planning for an uncertain future. They'd won a battle, but the war against organized crime continued across the country. Other communities faced similar threats, and the lesson of the Red Line Diner would need to spread. Red looked around at the unlikely alliance that had formed in crisis, former enemies united by common cause, strangers who'd become family through shared danger. Whatever came next, they'd proven that ordinary Americans could stand against extraordinary threats when they chose to act together. The night was far from over, and the real work of rebuilding was just beginning. The real work began in the pre-dawn darkness, when the federal agents had finished processing the crime scene, and the last of the syndicate operatives had been transported to detention facilities. Red stood in the ruins of his diner flashlight beam, cutting through the smoky air, cataloging damage that went far beyond broken windows and bullet holes. The heart of his community lay shattered, and rebuilding would require more than construction materials. Sarah arrived as the sun touched the horizon, her broken arm still in a sling, but her detective's shield restored to her belt. Internal Affairs had cleared her after Agent Parker's testimony about the corruption within the federal task force. She picked her way through the debris, her trained eye assessing the scene with professional detachment, until emotion broke through. "Dad, I'm so sorry. If I'd been here—" "You were exactly where you needed to be," Red interrupted, embracing his daughter carefully around her injured arm. "Fighting the system from inside while we fought it from outside." But even as they spoke, Red's attention was drawn to movement outside. Despite the early hour, people were gathering in the parking lot, not federal agents or investigators, but neighbors. Harold and Martha arrived first, followed by the elderly couple who'd refused to leave during the siege. The trucker who'd wielded a tire iron appeared with a thermos of coffee and a grim smile. "Thought you might need some help cleaning up," he said simply. Within an hour, the gathering had grown into something approaching a community barn raising. Angels from various chapters worked alongside suburban retirees. Federal contractors labored next to municipal workers, and Lila directed volunteers with the same efficiency she'd once used to manage the diner's morning rush. James supervised the removal of debris, his organizational skills proving as valuable in reconstruction as they had been in combat. "Nathan, you're supposed to be resting," he called to his injured brother, who was attempting to move broken furniture despite doctor's orders. "I'm fine," Nathan replied, then immediately winced as he lifted a damaged chair. "Okay, I'm not fine, but I'm not sitting on the sidelines while everyone else works." Mike and Ray had established a security perimeter, their Vietnam-trained paranoia proving justified when Snake's radio crackled with an urgent warning. "Movement on the south approach. Single vehicle moving fast, no escort." The volunteers froze memories of the previous night's violence still fresh. But the approaching car bore federal markings, and Agent Parker emerged alone, his hands visible and empty. "Mr. Kincaid, we need to talk, privately." Red followed Parker to his vehicle, noting the agent's tense posture and the way he constantly scanned their surroundings. "What's the situation?" "Complicated doesn't begin to cover it," Parker replied, pulling out a thick file. The Navarro syndicate had deeper penetration of federal agencies than we initially realized. The corruption goes beyond a few compromised agents. We're talking about systematic infiltration of law enforcement, judicial, and political systems. The implications hit Red like a physical blow. How deep? Deep enough that I can't guarantee your safety through official channels. The people who authorized last night's operation are still in place, still protected by classified authorities and political connections. Red absorbed this information, understanding that victory in battle didn't necessarily translate to victory in war. What are you suggesting? Off the record, you've created something unique here. A civilian defense network that operates outside traditional authority structures, but maintains legitimacy through community support. That makes you valuable and dangerous. Before Red could respond, Tommy's voice cut through their conversation from across the parking lot. Red, you need to see this. Now! They hurried back to find the volunteer crews gathered around a smartphone displaying a news broadcast. The reporter stood outside the federal building in downtown Denver, her expression grave as she delivered breaking news. Sources within the FBI confirm that yesterday's incident in Denver's industrial district was part of a larger federal investigation into organized crime infiltration of government agencies. What began as a local disturbance has exposed corruption reaching the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The broadcast continued with footage of arrests being made at FBI headquarters, DEA offices, and federal courthouses across the region. The syndicate's defeat had triggered a cascade of investigations that were unraveling criminal networks throughout the Rocky Mountain states. We did that, Lila said quietly, her voice carrying wonder and disbelief. We started something that's spreading everywhere. But the news wasn't entirely positive. The reporter's next words sent chills through the gathered volunteers. However, sources also confirm that several key figures in the corruption network remain at large, including federal prosecutors, regional administrators, and political appointees who provided legal cover for criminal operations. Parker's phone buzzed with an urgent call. He answered, listening intently before his face went pale. Understood. Yes, sir. Immediate evacuation protocols. He ended the call and turned to Red with professional urgency. We need to clear this area, now. Intelligence indicates retaliation operations are being planned against civilian targets associated with the investigation. The word retaliation electrified the volunteers. These weren't professional soldiers or law enforcement officers. They were ordinary citizens who'd stood up to extraordinary threats. The thought of ongoing danger of becoming permanent targets was almost overwhelming. But James stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced similar choices before. Anyone who wants to leave, leave now. No judgment, no questions asked. This isn't your fight anymore. Nobody moved. The trucker adjusted his cap and picked up a piece of debris. Harold continued sorting through salvageable equipment. Martha resumed sweeping broken glass with methodical determination. Guess it is our fight, the elderly man said with quiet dignity. Has been since they decided our neighborhood was expendable. Parker studied the group with something approaching admiration. Then we need to make this official. I can't provide federal protection through normal channels, but I can establish you as a community emergency response team. It provides legal authority for defensive activities and communication with law enforcement. Red considered the offer, understanding its implications. Accepting would formalize their resistance, creating an official record of their activities. It would also provide legal protection for future defensive actions, assuming the federal government remained trustworthy. What's the catch? Sarah asked, her detective's instincts sensing complications. The catch is that CERT authorization comes with responsibilities. You become the first line of response for emergency situations in this district. Natural disasters, terrorist incidents, civil unrest. You're officially on call." The volunteers exchanged glances, silently weighing the commitment. They'd stumbled into resistance through circumstance. Now they were being asked to make it a permanent responsibility. Snake's radio interrupted their deliberation. "Contact. Multiple vehicles approaching from the east. These aren't federal civilian cars, but moving in formation." Tension spiked immediately. Everyone had weapons within reach, positioned near cover, ready to resume combat at a moment's notice. The trauma of the previous night made every approaching vehicle a potential threat. But as the cars drew closer, Red recognized the lead vehicle, Captain Morrison's unmarked police sedan, followed by patrol cars from multiple jurisdictions and vehicles marked with county sheriff insignia. Morrison emerged from his car with the careful movements of a man entering potentially hostile territory. "Jack, we need to coordinate. The state has authorized a multi-jurisdictional task force to address the corruption issues exposed by your situation." Red met Morrison halfway across the parking lot, noting the captain's careful positioning and the way other officers remained near their vehicles. "Tom, what's the real story?" "The real story is that half the federal law enforcement apparatus in Colorado is under investigation. Local agencies are being asked to fill the gap, while internal affairs and federal inspectors sort out who can be trusted." Morrison pulled out a tablet displaying organizational charts that looked like spiderwebs of interconnected corruption. The syndicate didn't just buy individual agents, they systematically compromised entire chains of command. We're talking about decades of infiltration. The scope was staggering. Red realized they hadn't just fought a criminal organization, they'd exposed a shadow system that had been operating parallel to legitimate government for years. "What do you need from us?" Red asked. "Intelligence, mostly. You've got people embedded in communities we can't reach, relationships with organizations that don't trust badges. The biker networks, the trucker communications, the ham radio operators, that's intelligence infrastructure we can't replicate." James joined the conversation, his expression skeptical. "You want us to be informants?" "I want you to be partners," Morrison replied. "Full coordination, shared intelligence, mutual support. The days of agencies operating in isolation are over. This threat is too big for any single organization." Before anyone could respond, Lila's phone rang with an unknown number. She answered hesitantly, then her expression shifted to alarm. "It's Elena Keller, Thomas's sister. She says the FBI rescued her, but there are problems." Everyone gathered around as Lila activated the speakerphone. Elena's voice was young, frightened, but determined. "Please, you have to listen. The rescue, it wasn't complete. They got me out, but there are others. Dozens of others. The syndicate has been trafficking people for years, and the safe houses are still operational." The revelation added another layer of urgency to their situation. This wasn't just about territorial control or corruption. There were innocent lives at stake, victims who remained in syndicate custody. Agent Parker immediately activated his communication equipment, coordinating with federal task forces, while Elena provided locations and details. But even as rescue operations began, it became clear that the syndicate's human trafficking network was vast, sophisticated, and deeply embedded in legitimate businesses. "The diner," Elena said suddenly. "That's why they wanted your location so badly. It sits on the intersection of 3 major trafficking routes. Control that corner, and you control movement of people and drugs throughout the region." Red felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The elaborate attack, the military-level response, the corruption of federal agencies, it all made sense in the context of protecting a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise. But Elena's next words brought the threat into sharp focus. "There are still safe houses operating, and the people running them know you're responsible for shutting down the network. They're coming for revenge and they don't care about collateral damage." The phone went dead, leaving everyone staring at each other in the sudden silence. The battle they'd won was just the opening engagement in a larger war, and the enemy was already planning their next move. Morrison's radio crackled with reports from across the metropolitan area. Multiple locations being raided based on the Keller intelligence, but we're also getting reports of suspicious activity near schools, shopping centers, residential areas. They're threatening soft targets. The syndicate's strategy was becoming clear. If they couldn't reclaim their territory through direct assault, they would terrorize the civilian population into submission. It was psychological warfare designed to break community resolve. "How do we fight that?" Nathan asked, his young voice carrying the weight of realization that this might never truly end. "Same way we've been fighting," Red replied. "Together. Alert, organized, and ready to protect each other." But even as he spoke, Red understood that their small victory had unleashed forces beyond their control. The corruption Elena described had taken decades to build, dismantling. It would require sustained effort, constant vigilance, and sacrifices they hadn't yet imagined. Martha approached the group with her characteristic directness. "Harold and I have been talking. We're too old to be running around playing soldier, but we're not too old to coordinate communications and provide intelligence. Our house becomes the permanent command post." Her offer crystallized the transformation that had occurred. What began as an emergency response was evolving into a permanent community defense network, with each member contributing according to their abilities and circumstances. Tommy's military background made him the natural choice for tactical planning. Snake's reconnaissance skills would provide early warning of threats. The Angel's mobility and communication networks offered rapid response capabilities. Local law enforcement provided legal authority and coordination with regional agencies. But it was Lila who identified the crucial element. "We need a memorial," she said quietly. "Not just for what happened here, but for everyone who's been hurt by this network. The trafficking victims, the corrupted officials who lost their way, even the syndicate soldiers who died fighting for the wrong cause." The suggestion surprised everyone, but Red immediately understood its importance. A memorial would serve as both a reminder of the cost of corruption and a symbol of community determination to prevent future victimization. Sarah pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages from federal investigators. "Dad, Agent Parker wants to establish a permanent liaison position here. Someone to coordinate between federal agencies and the community network." "Who?" Red asked. "Him. He's requesting assignment as community coordinator, reporting directly to federal task force leadership, but embedded with local operations." The offer represented unprecedented cooperation between federal law enforcement and civilian defense organizations. It also represented a fundamental shift in how government agencies approached community protection. James lit a cigarette, studying the gathering crowd of volunteers who continued working despite the ongoing threats. "Hell of a thing," he mused. 6 months ago, if someone told me I'd be coordinating with cops and federal agents, I'd have laughed. 6 months ago, if someone told me I'd be working with the Hells Angels, I'd have recommended psychological evaluation," Red replied. "But that's what crisis does. It shows you what really matters." Ray's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. He read it, his expression hardening. "Problem. Message says, enjoy your victory. It won't last. We know where you live, where your families work, where your children go to school." The threat was both specific and general, designed to create maximum anxiety without providing actionable intelligence. But it confirmed what everyone already knew: this wasn't over. Morrison immediately activated emergency protocols coordinating with school districts, municipal services, and private security companies to establish protective measures for potential targets. But everyone understood that determined criminals could strike almost anywhere against almost anyone. "We can't protect everyone all the time," Sarah observed with frustrating accuracy. "No," Red agreed. "But we can make it too expensive for them to keep trying. Every attack they make exposes more of their network, provides more intelligence, creates more evidence for prosecution." Agent Parker rejoined the group after coordinating federal response to the threat. "We're implementing Operation Sunlight," he announced. "Complete transparency in all federal law enforcement activities in this region. Every operation, every investigation, every arrest gets reported to community liaisons in real time." The proposal was revolutionary. Federal agencies had never voluntarily surrendered the operational secrecy that had enabled corruption to flourish. But extraordinary circumstances required extraordinary measures. As the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the destroyed diner, Red surveyed what they'd built in the ruins. Not just a building that would come later, but a network of relationships, a system of mutual support, a community determined to protect itself against threats both criminal and institutional. Harold's ham radio crackled with reports from across the region. Similar community defense networks were forming in response to their example, local groups organizing to resist criminal infiltration and government corruption. The model was spreading, adapted to local circumstances, but based on the same principles of community self-reliance and mutual aid. "We started something," Lila observed, echoing her earlier words, but with deeper understanding of their implications. "Question is whether we can sustain it." Mike replied, his Vietnam experience providing perspective on the challenges of long-term resistance operations. The answer would depend on factors beyond their control: political developments, criminal adaptations, public support, and the ability of ordinary citizens to maintain extraordinary commitment over months and years rather than hours and days. But as Red looked around at the faces of people who'd chosen to stand together, despite the risks, he felt cautiously optimistic about their chances. They'd proven that determined civilians could successfully resist both criminal violence and institutional corruption. The real test would be whether they could build something permanent from their temporary victory. The war was far from over, but they'd demonstrated that it could be won. The rest would depend on whether America still had enough people willing to fight for the principles that made victory worthwhile. The afternoon sun beat down on the ruins of the Red Line Diner, but also on the foundations of something new. A community that had learned to defend itself and was determined never to forget the lesson. 3 months after the siege, the new Red Line Diner rose from its predecessor's ashes like a phoenix, with bulletproof glass and reinforced steel. Red stood behind the gleaming new counter coffee pot in hand, watching the morning rush that had become something far more complex than simple breakfast service. The booth in the corner, the same spot where the Hells Angels had first made their stand, now bore a small plaque reading, "Reserved for Guardian Angels," and it was rarely empty. Agent Parker occupied his usual stool at the counter laptop open as he coordinated federal task force operations with local community networks. The arrangement that had begun as emergency cooperation had evolved into a permanent partnership with the diner, serving as an unofficial liaison office between federal law enforcement and civilian defense organizations. "Status report," Red asked, refilling Parker's cup. 17 more trafficking safe houses shut down this week, Parker replied quietly. Elena's intelligence network is proving more valuable than 3 years of traditional investigation. Elena Keller herself sat 2 stools down, her young face bearing the wisdom that comes from surviving hell and choosing to fight back. She'd refused witness protection, instead becoming the coordinator for a survivor network that provided intelligence support and hope to other trafficking victims across the region. The Denver safe house raid yesterday recovered 12 victims, she reported to Red, her voice steady despite the weight of the subject matter. All minors all being prepared for transport to other states. The ongoing rescues provided constant reminders that their victory at the diner had consequences extending far beyond their immediate community. Every network they disrupted, every safe house they identified, every corrupt official they exposed meant lives saved and families reunited. But the victories came with costs. Nathan limped through the diner's front door, his injuries from that first night having healed imperfectly, leaving him with permanent damage that served as a daily reminder of the price of resistance. Behind him came James, Mike, and Ray, the core of what had become known throughout law enforcement circles as the Angel Protocol, a civilian defense model being studied and replicated across the country. "Morning briefing?" James asked, settling into the reserved booth. "Coffee first?" Red replied, bringing a thermal pot to their table. "Bad news tastes worse on an empty stomach." Martha Brennan emerged from the kitchen carrying plates of eggs and bacon, her presence in the diner's operations having evolved from volunteer to essential staff member. At 87, she moved with purpose that belied her age, coordinating supply chains, managing communications, and providing the kind of institutional memory that kept complex operations running smoothly. "Harold's monitoring federal frequencies," she reported to the group. "Something big is happening in Chicago. Task force movements, emergency authorizations, the kind of chatter that suggests major arrests." Sarah entered through the rear entrance, her detective's shield catching the morning light as she surveyed the room with professional awareness. Her broken arm had healed, but she still favored it slightly when stress levels rose. The internal affairs investigation had cleared her completely, but the experience had left her with a deeper understanding of how quickly institutional support could evaporate. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, her expression carrying the weight of official information. "Privately." They moved to Red's office, a reinforced space that had been designed as both administrative center and secure communication facility. Sarah closed the door and activated a white noise generator that had become standard equipment for sensitive conversations. "The Navarro Syndicate's leadership structure has been completely dismantled," she began. "Federal prosecutors are calling it the most successful organized crime investigation in decades. But there's a problem." Red waited, understanding that good news usually came with complications. "The success has attracted attention from other criminal organizations. Intelligence suggests multiple syndicates are moving to fill the power vacuum, and they're all studying what happened here." The implication was sobering. Their victory had become a case study, not just for law enforcement, but for criminal enterprises seeking to understand how civilian resistance had defeated a seemingly superior force. "What kind of attention?" Red asked. "The kind where your name appears in intercepted communications from cartels in Mexico, crime families in Chicago, and international trafficking networks in Eastern Europe. You've become famous, Dad. The wrong kind of famous." Before Red could respond, the office door burst open. Tommy stood in the doorway, his usual calm replaced by urgent alarm. "Red, we've got multiple problems. Snake's reporting unusual activity at 3 locations simultaneously, and Harold's picking up coordinated communications that suggest synchronized operations." They rushed back to the main dining area where the normal morning routine had transformed into something resembling a military command center. Laptops displayed surveillance feeds. Radios crackled with reports from observation posts throughout the industrial district, and the reserved booth had become a tactical planning station. Snake's voice came through clearly on the radio frequency they'd designated for security communications. Movement at the rail yard. Count 6 vehicles tactical formation. These aren't locals' license plates from multiple states' professional coordination. Mike was already pulling up digital maps on his tablet marking reported positions with the precision of a man who'd spent decades reading battlefield intelligence. They're establishing overwatch positions. Classic surveillance pattern, probably preparing for coordinated assault. But this time was different. The community network that had formed around the diner had grown into something approaching a neighborhood intelligence service. Reports came in from Harold's ham radio operators, from trucker networks, from municipal workers and business owners who'd learned to recognize potential threats. Activity at Jefferson Elementary, came one report. Unusual concentration of vehicles in the pickup zone occupants not matching parent profiles. Construction crew at the shopping center has been working the same section for 3 days without visible progress. Came another. Equipment doesn't match the work orders filed with the city. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and terrifying. Instead of direct assault, the new threat involved positioning assets near schools, shopping centers, and residential areas soft targets, where civilian casualties would be inevitable and community response would be constrained by the presence of innocents. Lila moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, serving coffee and breakfast, while simultaneously coordinating communication between various civilian defense networks. Her transformation from frightened waitress to community coordinator had been gradual, but complete her experience with domestic violence, providing crucial insights into the psychology of intimidation and resistance. "They're trying to force us into an impossible choice," she observed, pausing at the tactical planning booth. "Fight back and risk civilian casualties, or submit and watch the community be destroyed slowly." Agent Parker was already coordinating with federal resources, but the scope of the threat was becoming clear. Multiple criminal organizations had formed a loose coalition specifically to neutralize the Denver model before it could spread further. The stakes had escalated from local territory control to national criminal policy. "How many are we looking at?" James asked. "Intelligence suggests 50 to 60 operatives from at least 4 different organizations," Parker replied. "Cartels, traditional organized crime families, human trafficking networks, and international syndicates. They've put aside territorial disputes to address what they see as an existential threat." The numbers were daunting, but more concerning was the sophistication of the coordination. These weren't street thugs or even military contractors. They were experienced criminals who'd studied the diner's defensive success and adapted their tactics accordingly. Elena looked up from her laptop, where she'd been monitoring communication channels used by trafficking networks. "There's something else. They're not just targeting the diner or the neighborhood. They've identified key personnel from every community defense network that's formed based on our model. This is a coordinated decapitation strike." The revelation sent chills through everyone present. The enemy had learned from previous mistakes, expanding their target set to include not just the original resistors, but everyone who'd been inspired by their example. The attack, when it came, would be designed to destroy the entire concept of civilian defense networking. Red felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. People across the country had organized community defense groups based on the Red Line model, trusting that the tactics and principles that had worked in Denver would protect their own neighborhoods. Now those same people were in danger because of decisions he'd made months earlier. "We can't protect everyone," Sarah stated the obvious with painful accuracy. "No," Red agreed, "but we can make sure their sacrifice isn't in vain." Nathan, despite his injuries, was already pulling up communication software on his phone. "Time to activate the full network. Every chapter, every affiliated organization, every community group that's adopted our protocols. If they want to fight all of us at once, let's give them that fight." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, radio traffic exploded with reports from across the country as civilian defense networks activated emergency protocols simultaneously. The enemy had planned a coordinated strike, but they hadn't anticipated a coordinated defense spanning multiple states and involving thousands of ordinary citizens who'd learned to stand together. But even as the defensive network mobilized, troubling intelligence continued to arrive. Ray's contact at the freight yards reported unusual shipments arriving under federal manifest numbers that didn't correspond to any authorized operations. Tommy's military connections identified weapons signatures that suggested the criminal coalition had access to military-grade equipment, including explosives and heavy weapons. Most concerning was a report from Harold's ham radio network. Unusual air traffic detected. Multiple helicopters converging on Denver from different directions, civilian markings, but military flight patterns. The criminal coalition wasn't just planning a ground assault, they intended to replicate the syndicate's failed air support, but with better coordination and heavier firepower. Martha approached Red with a handwritten note, her elderly features grave with concern. Message came through the emergency frequency. Someone claiming to represent the coalition wants to negotiate. Red read the note, recognizing the careful language of someone accustomed to avoiding electronic surveillance. The proposed meeting location was neutral ground, the federal building downtown, with official law enforcement present as witnesses. "It's a trap," James said immediately upon hearing the proposal. "Of course it's a trap," Red agreed. "Question is whether we can turn it to our advantage." Parker was already coordinating with federal security services, arranging for a negotiation session that would provide maximum protection while allowing for dialogue. But everyone understood that criminals who'd coordinated a multi-state intimidation campaign weren't likely to be satisfied with compromise solutions. The meeting was scheduled for noon, giving both sides time to position assets and prepare for various contingencies. Red would attend as community representative, accompanied by Agent Parker and Captain Morrison, with Sarah providing additional law enforcement liaison. But as they prepared to leave for downtown, Snake's voice crackled over the radio with urgent alarm. "All units be advised. The elementary school evacuation was a diversion. While we were focused on the obvious threat, they've positioned explosives near the diner's gas lines." The revelation transformed everything. The coalition wasn't planning to negotiate, they were buying time while positioning for a devastating attack that would destroy not just the diner, but several blocks of surrounding buildings. Tommy was already moving his military explosive ordnance training, making him the natural choice to assess and neutralize the threat. But even as he headed for the basement where gas lines entered the building, reports continued to arrive of similar threats at other locations. "This is what they learned," Elena said with sudden understanding. "Not to fight us directly, but to threaten everything we care about simultaneously. Force us to choose what to save." The criminal coalition's strategy was becoming clear. Instead of military assault, they'd opted for terrorism threatening civilian infrastructure, schools, and residential areas to break community will and demonstrate the futility of resistance. But they'd underestimated something crucial about the community they were trying to terrorize. The people who'd stood together during the original siege had spent months building relationships, sharing skills, and preparing for exactly this kind of distributed threat. Mike coordinated with municipal services to shut down gas supplies and evacuate potential blast zones. Ray worked with truckers to establish emergency supply routes that bypassed threatened infrastructure. Nathan, despite his injuries, managed communication with defensive networks across the region, ensuring coordinated response to simultaneous threats. Lila took charge of civilian evacuation, her experience with domestic violence situations providing crucial insights into managing fear and maintaining organization under extreme stress. Her calm authority kept panic from spreading, even as the scope of the threat became clear. The bomb disposal took 47 minutes of careful work in confined spaces, while reports continued to arrive of additional devices being discovered and neutralized across the metropolitan area. Tommy's hands remained steady throughout the process, his military training evident in every precise movement as he disconnected detonators and rendered explosives safe. When the all-clear finally came, everyone understood that they'd passed a crucial test. The criminal coalition's most sophisticated attack had failed not because of superior firepower or tactical advantage, but because ordinary citizens had learned to work together effectively under pressure. Agent Parker's phone buzzed with a priority message from Federal Task Force leadership. He read it quickly, then looked up with something approaching amazement. Coordinated raids are taking place across 7 states. Every major figure in the criminal coalition is being arrested simultaneously. The timing wasn't coincidental. While the coalition had focused on terrorizing the Denver community, federal investigators had used the coordination itself as intelligence tracking communications and identifying leadership structures that had remained hidden for years. How? James asked. Elena's network, Parker replied, looking at the young woman with professional respect. Every communication channel the coalition used to coordinate their attacks was being monitored by trafficking survivors who'd learned to recognize the patterns. They've been feeding us intelligence for weeks. Elena's quiet smile carried satisfaction that went beyond simple victory. They thought survivors were broken, defeated, afraid to fight back. They were wrong. The arrests continued throughout the afternoon, with federal agents dismantling criminal networks that had taken decades to build. The coalition's attempt to destroy civilian defense networking had instead provided law enforcement with unprecedented access to criminal communication and coordination systems. But even as victory celebrations began, Red remained focused on the broader implications. The criminal organizations had been defeated, but the underlying conditions that allowed them to flourish, corruption, institutional failures, community isolation, required ongoing attention. Martha approached with fresh coffee and a perspective shaped by 8 decades of American history. You know what this reminds me of? The Victory Gardens during World War II. Started as emergency response became permanent change in how communities took care of themselves. Her observation crystallized something Red had been thinking about for months. What began as desperate self-defense had evolved into a new model of community organization, one that combined civilian initiative with law enforcement cooperation and federal support. Sarah returned from coordinating with federal investigators, her expression mixing exhaustion with satisfaction. Dad, they want to formalize the Guardian Angel Protocol, make it official federal policy for community defense networking. The proposal represented vindication of everything they'd built, but Red hesitated. Official recognition would provide resources and legal protection, but it might also constrain the flexibility and independence that had made their network effective. "What do you think?" he asked the assembled group. James lit a cigarette, studying the question with the deliberation of someone who'd spent decades balancing independence with cooperation. Depends on the terms. We keep operational control. We keep our people. We keep our principles, then maybe. But the moment bureaucrats start telling us how to protect our community, we walk. Agent Parker nodded, understanding. The proposal maintains local autonomy while providing federal support and legal framework. Think of it as official recognition rather than federal control. Nathan looked around the diner, rebuilt stronger than before, filled with people who'd chosen to stand together, despite the risks. Seems like we've already proven it works. Question is whether making it official helps or hurts other communities trying to build similar networks. Elena's perspective carried the authority of someone who'd seen both the worst and best of human behavior. Official recognition means resources for survivor networks, legal protection for witnesses, and systematic support for communities fighting trafficking and corruption. It means other places won't have to start from scratch. The discussion continued as the sun set behind the Denver skyline, casting golden light through bulletproof windows that had become symbols of both vulnerability and resilience. Outside life in the industrial district continued with a normalcy that had been hard-won and was carefully maintained. Tommy raised a practical concern. What about communities that don't have angels? Not every neighborhood has an established organization to build around. That's where the truckers come in, Ray replied. And the ham radio operators, the veterans groups, the neighborhood watch programs. Every community has people willing to stand up. They just need to know how to organize and who to call for help. Martha's husband, Harold, descended from his communication post in the basement, his elderly face bright with information from his radio networks. Interesting development. Communities in 17 states are requesting guidance on establishing guardian angel protocols. The model is spreading faster than we can provide support. The success was both gratifying and overwhelming. What began as a single diner's resistance to criminal intimidation had inspired a national movement toward community self-defense and civilian law enforcement cooperation. Lila moved through the diner's evening crowd, noting the mix of regulars and newcomers, locals, and visitors who'd come to see the place where ordinary Americans had proven they could successfully resist both criminal violence and institutional corruption. "You know what's different now?" she asked Red as they worked together behind the counter. "People believe they can make a difference. Not just here, but everywhere. That's worth more than any federal program or official recognition." Red watched the interaction in his diner, angels sharing coffee with federal agents, elderly couples discussing security protocols with military veterans, trafficking survivors coordinating with law enforcement officers who'd learned to listen rather than just investigate. The transformation was complete but ongoing. What had begun in crisis continued in commitment sustained not by adrenaline and emergency, but by daily choices to remain engaged, aware, and ready to protect each other. As closing time approached, the core group gathered in the reserved booth for their customary evening briefing. Reports from across the country confirmed that the guardian angel model was taking root in communities facing their own challenges with crime, corruption, and institutional failures. 6 months ago, James observed, "If someone told me I'd be coordinating with cops and federal agents to help communities organize civilian defense networks, I'd have checked them for head injuries." 6 months ago, Red replied, "If someone told me my diner would become the headquarters for a national movement, I'd have recommended psychiatric evaluation." But the impossible had become routine. The extraordinary had become normal, and the temporary alliance forged in crisis had evolved into permanent change in how Americans thought about community protection and the relationship between citizens and government. Elena checked her phone one final time, monitoring communication channels that connected trafficking survivors across the globe. 17 more people rescued today. 4 more safe houses identified. 3 more corrupt officials arrested. The network keeps growing. Nathan, despite his injuries, was already planning the next day's activities. "Tomorrow we start training the Phoenix group. Next week it's the Portland Community Network. The demand for guidance is incredible." The evening briefing concluded with Martha's traditional reminder about basic security protocols, Harold's weather report from his ham radio contacts, and Agent Parker's summary of federal task force activities that would affect local operations. As the last customer left and the diner's lights dimmed, Red stood behind the counter one final time, reflecting on the journey from desperate resistance to permanent change. The coffee pot was clean, the cash register balanced the floors, swept normal closing procedures for an establishment that had become anything but normal. Lila was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the space where she'd been terrorized, defended, and ultimately empowered. "See you tomorrow, Red." "See you tomorrow." The simple exchange carried weight beyond its words. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new communities seeking guidance, new threats requiring response. But it would also bring the continued presence of people who'd learned that ordinary citizens could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to stand together. Red locked the door and activated security systems that were both high-tech and decidedly low-tech federal surveillance equipment alongside trusted neighbors who kept watch electronic monitoring supplemented by community awareness that had proven more effective than any technology. The Red Line Diner's neon sign flickered to life in the darkness, its red glow casting familiar light across the industrial district. But now, it illuminated more than just a neighborhood restaurant. It marked the birthplace of a movement that had spread across the nation, proving that democracy wasn't just a political system, but a way of life that people would fight to preserve. The guardian angels in leather cuts and police uniforms in civilian clothes and federal badges would return tomorrow. The work continued, the network grew stronger, and America learned once again that its greatest strength lay not in institutions or authorities, but in ordinary people who refused to be ordinary when circumstances demanded courage. The storm had passed, but the community it forged remained stronger for having been tested and ready for whatever challenges the future might bring.